AM 560, The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios.
Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. So Paul Thacker and Matt Taibbi, two investigative journalists, sat down to do Mario Nawfal's podcast to discuss the story we discussed yesterday on this Center for Countering Digital Hate that originates in the UK but made landfall in the U.S. to advance the censorious agenda of the left. And the documents that Thacker and Taibbi unearthed that show the plan of CCDH, which has been sued by Elon Musk because he knew what they were doing. Now there's some evidence to support it. Kill Musk's Twitter on their essentially objectives and targeting advertisers as the way to do it. Here is a little backstory on CCDH, because they didn't just get here and build this apparatus they have. The way that they came and how quickly they became prominent suggests that there's a more likely than not alliance with the party of one Kamala Harris.
Now, when they landed in D.C., what caught my attention about them, I was like, wait, who are these people? They've been they're being referenced from the podium of the White House. I worked in the Senate. I'm a creature of DC. I have friends on multiple committees. I called a friend of mine who's now works on the House side for Democrats. And we're talking about this about 6 months ago. And I was telling him, I was like, and I'm not going to say his name because it's a person with a career. I was like, think about this. You've worked at Public Citizen. You worked at a major donor. You know all these lefty do-gooder groups. You're now on the Hill. You went to you're a graduate of one of the top law schools in America. If you left the Hill tomorrow, could you raise $1.5 million the way, Imran Ahmed did? And he's like, no. And I was like, that tells you something's going on. Where's this money coming from?
They had instantaneous pull at the highest levels in a way that was not really explicable, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Oh, explicable other than to understand that they're allied with the powers that be in D.C., and that was Thacker first and then Taibbi at the end. More from Thacker on the report they issued on CCDH, Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is the podcast host pointed out. It sounds like a comic book villainous, right. A villainous comic book organization, the Center for Countering Digital Hate.
There was a Twitter file I found that I wrote about just a couple of months ago that showed that while Twitter was saying that, because after this all came out, we were independent of State Department. We weren't bending to FBI. You can go back and look at those Joel Roth statements. That was a total lie. And we know this in part because while Twitter was having State Department lean on them to say, we want you to censor certain things, Twitter was actively working with State Department, collaborating with them to deal with problems they were having in India. So it was just how can you be independent of State Department when you've hired a Democratic, lobbying firm, former State Department, led by Madeleine Albright, right, to help you deal with problems in India? Meanwhile, you're ignoring State Department. They tell you to censor things. It was one of the weirdest things ever. So none of this ever made any sense. At the most, what you can say is what the Twitter files showed us is something weird was going on here and we were being misled. This is a whole different level because now we know that one of the main groups involved in this, big disinformation, censorship industrial complex, they were actively working to kill mass Twitter. And the second bullet point on this, advertising focus, which is how we know this thing has been working. Let's label someone. Let's make them look crazy. Then they can't have a job. Then they can't, have advertising, have any revenue flow. Musk has been complaining this is what's going on, right? He sued them because he knows that he knew this was going on. Now we have the proof.
For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by John Solomon, award-winning investigative journalist in his own right and founder of Just the News, justthenews.com. John, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Your reaction to the latest offering that's from essentially the Twitter or X-verse, as it were, the work of Thacker and Taibbi on this Center for Countering Digital Hate.
I've known Paul a long time, very long time, back when he was in the Senate. Listen, it's part of a large censorship ecosystem that the Democrats began advocating for after Donald Trump won in 2016 and after Brexit succeeded in Great Britain. And Western world suddenly turned on the notion that a free society should have free speech. And it's a massive ecosystem that was built, some of it with government money, some of it with government encouragement. CISA, the Homeland Security's Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, actually convinced itself that protecting infrastructure meant regulating speech. Mm-hmm. And they set forth and started having all of these seminars. And from these seminars came these nonprofit groups funded often by the left, designed to regulate speech and specifically regulate speech of the conservatives in the world, myself included. During the 2019 Hunter Biden scandal, when I broke all the stories, there was an effort to portray me as suddenly off-the-hinged journalist when every single thing I wrote at the time was true, and it's remained true 5 years later. In fact, more true than anyone ever knew, including myself, how big a scandal it would be. But the effort was to portray you as unhinged, to portray you as disinformation, and then over time to thwart your ability to succeed or to sustain yourself as a journalist by cutting off your advertising. So it moved from free speech to interference in the free marketplace. And these organizations popped up. Most of them were nonprofit, supported by tax-deductible donations. Some were for-profit, but they all worked together in concert with each other. And their goal was, their stated goal was to stop disinformation. Their real goal was to stop the free speech of conservatives and to ruin their business model short and long term. And they found complicitous actors in big tech, in big media, and in big government. And it wasn't until we started writing stories in the summer of 2020, all the way through early 2023, right after the Twitter files started coming out. But we identified the entire ecosystem with a great reporter named Greg Piper, and we made a map of it. And over time, the Foundation for Freedom Online with Mike Benz began to accelerate the spotlight on these groups, and slowly now they're beginning to fall away. There was another one that tried to start up. There was one that died called GARM, and then we kept an eye on it thinking, well, maybe they're not really going to die. Maybe they're just going to rebrand. And sure as heck, a new group popped up with the same mission with a different name, and that got highlighted quickly. Jim Jordan, the House Judiciary Committee chairman, started asking questions, and last week we learned that group said, you know what, it's not worth the aggravation of Congress always investigating us. We're not going to do it. We're not going to do it again ever. So slowly, because of the antiseptic of daylight, we're starting to expose and shut down what really is one of the most anti-First Amendment movements in the history of this country.
Wow. Is that NewsGuard you're talking about?
Nope. No, NewsGuard's a whole other one that we have to keep an eye on, right? We try to work with them. But at the same time, no, these are just other coalitions that are starting to form. They come up with good-sounding group names, but in fact what they're really doing is trying to find different avenues to, under the flag of disinformation, shut down free speech, particularly those of conservatives and conservative news media. Well, they've had a tremendous effect. I mean, the business model for conservative media has been strangled significantly over the last 3 years.
Well, I bring up NewsGuard because Mike Benz has brought up NewsGuard as an example of sort of the 2.0 version of this censorship industrial complex, where there won't be any need to talk directly to the social media companies to put pressure on them to comport with the wishes of the regime or the Beltway insiders. You'll just have these sort of independent operations like NewsGuard with all the usual suspects, General Michael Hayden and Tom Ridge, a former Homeland Security Secretary. They'll just be there, and they don't need to take they don't need any direction. You just sort of take your cues, and they're also talking about trying to sort of working with these social media companies to do front end censorship too, so you don't have to leave a footprint with back end censorship.
Listen, it's very interesting that one of the greatest acts of disinformation meddling in an American election. The letter written by 51 intelligence agents didn't get flagged by any of these disinformation
Right.
entities. What does that tell you? That they're so good, they missed perhaps the single largest disinformation intrusion in the American public. And by the way, where did those 51 come from? They came from our intelligence agency. They came from the apparatus that Mike Hayden and others built in the aftermath of 9/11. By the way, on the watch of a Republican president.
Yeah.
The Homeland Security apparatus took the moment of fear and horror that we all went through in 9/11 and turned it into a monstrous government agency that now really risks the intruding on a daily basis on the liberties of Americans. When Tulsi Gabbard can be put on a flight list just because she bolted from her party and decided to support Donald Trump, what does that tell you about how far this apparatus has been built? And it'll be incumbent, if Donald Trump wins the presidency, and that's still an if, but if he does, to begin dismantling this in a big way, because it still has massive funding, it still has massive bureaucracy behind it, and it has the mindset in a government agency that can be exported to these nonprofit groups. And it's going to be incumbent upon the president to dismantle whatever has been built at Homeland Security that thinks its job is to regulate political speech.
Well, John Solomon, I wanted to ask you about those 51 former senior intelligence officers, some CIA, who all have egg on their face. Did any of them come out and say, I was wrong? Or
Nope. Most of them have doubled down, saying they do it again.
What?
And I think that is so extraordinary in and of itself. And I think at the end of the day, one of the truisms, when you step back and you really look at what Paul Thacker and Matt Taibbi and John Solomon and Greg Piper and Mike Benz have been able to expose over the last 4 or 5 years, Michael Shackelford and others, the government created these PSYOP tools to fight our enemies after 9/11, psychological operations tools. You can make anything look like it is real, even if it isn't. That's what Russia collusion was about, right? We created the illusion that Donald Trump was a stooge of the Russian government when, in fact, he wasn't. These are all PSYOP tools that our own military turned. And then these military people who developed those tools for good reason, right, to fight the war, to fight terrorism, to fight our enemies abroad, turned these tools against the American people and began creating the illusion of truth in America, when in fact what they were doing was trying to defeat one side over the other in the classic Republican-Democrat election. These tools that create illusions, like the letter, the carefully worded letter that made it sound like the laptop was Russian disinformation when there wasn't an iota of truth, is not much different from the original Steele dossier, which made it look like Donald Trump was a Russian stooge. And let's keep in mind, when the Biden Justice Department put out its final report through the special prosecutor, they said there wasn't one iota of evidence to justify that. But they made it look real. And the ability to make things look real, the ability to use disinformation as a weapon, that emanated in our intelligence communities in the 9/11 era to fight people overseas. It's been turned on our own American people now.
And they're all singing from the same hymnal. They're doing it again with the notion. Yeah. I mean, this is rich, too, not just the Hitler stuff, but the idea that, well, I guess it's associated, the idea that they have roundtables every day where Al Sharpton, are you worried that Donald Trump's going to put you in prison? Donnie Deutsch, are you worried that Donald Trump's going to put you in prison? He's going to put all of us wonderful journalists in prison. He's the real threat to freedom of speech and thought in America.
It is pretty remarkable. And it's pretty remarkable that in the last few days we saw Democrats embrace General John Kelly. Why is that? Because 3 years ago, the very same Democrats, including Kamala Harris herself, questioned his honesty, his ethics, his truthfulness. Kamala Harris said he can't speak truth to power. That was 3 years ago. Today, she's embracing him. Why? Because they turned down Donald Trump. This whole system got spun into a dizzy because Democrats could not stand the notion that Donald Trump had been selected by the American people, and it has now gone to a place where I don't think any of our founding fathers could ever have imagined.
You recently spoke to the aforesaid President Trump, former President Trump, and I thought it was interesting that this was a good idea that you guys kicked around, the notion that maybe Trump will set up a compensation fund for victims of illegal immigration when if and when he is installed as the 47th president. I think it would be appropriate because, I mean, they were invited in, they did harm to Americans. The federal government does have responsibility.
There is a history in the government, when the government approved something or did something that then became harmful to the American people, to create some form of compensation. Certainly the failures of 9/11 led to the 9/11 compensation fund. We have vaccine injury funds for vaccines that we approve for the American people, but then caused harm for some. And so the notion is actually rooted in a lot of history, and it's also rooted in Donald Trump's experience. He has spent so much time with the moms and dads of these young women who were raped and killed, and the young children that were killed, or the families that lost loved ones because a drunken driver who was illegally in the country crashed into their car. And I think he has felt very passionate about protecting them, helping them, and he knows they have lots of needs. Just having a press conference with them doesn't solve the issues that they may have with counseling and with family support and lost income. And so when I mentioned this to him, because Congresswoman Virginia Foxx had floated the idea, he hadn't heard of it, but he said, listen, I like this idea. It's the right thing to do. The government authorized these people into the country. These people then came and did heinous things. Maybe we should find a way to help those who've been victimized, because, by the way, they still haven't been able to lift themselves off the mat. They still have lots of pain and sorrow and needs and losses that need to be addressed. And so it's very interesting. He's been a very ideas-driven candidate all through this campaign, whether it's no tax on tips or considering this idea for a compensation fund or reparations fund. Donald Trump has led with ideas, and Kamala Harris hasn't. She's actually tried to hide her ideas. And I think it's going to, when we wake up later in November after all the smoke's cleared from the election, I think it'll be Kamala Harris's unwillingness to put ideas on the table and Donald Trump's incessant machine of putting new ideas on the table that might have made the difference in this election.
John Solomon, award-winning investigative journalist, founder of Just the News, justthenews.com. John, thank you as always.
Yeah, great to be with you guys.
Thank you. Certainly is an honor. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to Dan and Amy on your smartphone. Download the AM560 mobile app today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
Safety. It's so important at your industrial facility. You need to keep your personnel safe and meet OSHA requirements. One problem with